Hi, this is Richard Azariga from Microsoft, and in this video, I'm going to go over just some basics around building applications secured by Azure Active Directory, specifically V2 applications. And there's a ton of confusion, I think, around several aspects of building Azure AD secured applications around things like admin consent, delegated versus application type permissions, and I'm going to try to clear those up in like a relatively short video here. So first of all, I'm in the app registration portal. So this is apps.dev.microsoft.com. This is where you will go for any V2 app registration for now. You know, at some point you'll be able to do that from the Azure portal, but right now the Azure portal is really about registering V1 apps, which is a whole different kind of story. But I'm going to concentrate on V2 apps, which is again done on apps.dev.microsoft.com. You can sign into this portal both with an MSA account and with a normal like commercial Office 365 account. I'm just signed in right now as an MSA account. It actually doesn't matter. All V2 apps are inherently multi-tenant, and so you can build an app with MSA and then use it with like an Office 365 account, and that's actually quite common. But just to kind of prove this out here, you can see I'm signed in with just my normal Hotmail account. All right, so I'm going to define a new app that we're going to use here. We're going to use it in a bunch of different ways. So let's just go ahead and give it a name. We'll call this the Richard app. Why not? And we'll go ahead and create it. So I'm going to build this Richard app. And when it kind of comes in here, you're going to immediately want to start capturing some information. So first of all, the application ID. Now, I'll be honest with you, there is some confusion in our terminology. We don't do the best job at Microsoft around essentially having the same terminology everywhere. So sometimes you'll see this called a client ID or an app ID. Essentially, it's all the same thing. An application ID is a client ID, as an app ID. They're all the same. So I'm going to capture a few of these things. I have a little OneNote here that I'm going to capture some things in. So we'll just say app ID, and we'll paste this in here. And then the other thing we're going to want to do is generate a secret for our application. So we'll go ahead and say generate secret. If you've never used this before, you need to copy it because you can never display a secret again. So make sure you get it captured when you do this. You can certainly generate new secrets, but just my tip would be do it there. So the just terminology here. Sometimes an app secret is called an app password. Sometimes it's called a client secret, a client password. So there's like all these different terminologies. I just want you to be aware of that, and I'm just going to format this so it's a little bit easier to see. But there we go. I have my app ID and my app secret here in my just little OneNote. The next thing I'm going to do is add a platform. For our case, there's a number of different ways we support kind of securing applications. You can secure web applications, native applications, APIs. We're going to go with web just because it's the easiest to kind of toy around with. And I'm going to put my reply URI as HTTPS, and I'm just going to use localhost for now. Now, the reply URL, essentially what this is for is it needs to match up with all your authentication flows, but it's also used in some of the flows for essentially getting information back. So you can use this to get back information around an authorization code so you can finish and get a token. I'll show you this if that's not making sense, but essentially I'm going to use localhost here. And then finally, I'm going to set up some permissions. Now, it's important to note that with V2, you don't necessarily have to predefine permissions like you see here. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of user.read, and I'm going to add a few different delegated permissions. I'm going to add, you can see that there's a big list here, and the important thing is probably this first column, which is saying whether or not a user can consent to this or not. What this means is if you create an application using a permission that the user can't consent to, they're going to get a big error message when they try to use the application. And so in general, it's probably best to try to avoid any permission that requires admin consent. However, there's some cases where like you flat out are going to need it, and I'm going to show you kind of what that looks like. So we're going to select something that needs admin consent. In this case, let's just select groups read all. So this is saying I want to read all the groups. A user can't consent to it. I'm going to show you exactly what that looks like when it happens. The other thing I'm going to put in here is OpenID and offline access. OpenID is just like simple sign-in experience, and then offline access will allow me to get longer-term access to the data through a refresh token. And I'll briefly explain that when we get to it. So that's a delegated permission, and essentially what this is you're going to use this to get tokens that are specific to a user. So if Lily signs in, you're going to get a token for Lily, and it's only going to be able to perform operations as Lily. If you needed to perform operations like across like all users as like a super account, you would want an application permission. Now, any application permission, all of them require an admin to consent to it, which essentially means an admin of that organization has to introduce it into the tenant. And that's why you see a normal user can't consent to this. You can see they're all no. That column is no across the board. So in this case, we'll do the exact same permission. We'll do group read all. And again, it will require an admin to consent to that. So I think we're good. We're going to go ahead and save all our changes here. And let's start kind of the process of getting some tokens and getting some data. So the most common type of flow that a user is going to do with Azure AD is a code authorization flow. It's essentially you're going to redirect them to ensure that they're signed in and have consented to the application. Once that's all been done, it essentially returns your application a code that you use to get a token. And a token essentially then calls into the graph or whatever you need to. So let's try this as like a normal user with the information that we've had here. So if I go back to OneNote, you can see I have this code authorization flow. It's a simple get, so you essentially redirect a user to it. And then you need to fill in some of the little parameters that it needs, like a client ID. A scope is the permissions that you're going to use, a redirect URI, and a response type. So let me just fill in the details here for our application. So we have our client ID. Our scope in this case is going to be OpenID, and then you can kind of build these together with pluses. So I'm going to say this, and we also want offline underscore access, and then we want group.read.all. And then our redirect URI is HTTPS localhost. So let's go ahead and try this out. I'm going to just build this as one long URI here, and let's go ahead and paste this into an in-private browser. So I'm going to essentially, here I'm going to sign in as an admin. So a normal admin, if they try to use our application, we'll go ahead and click this, and I'm going to sign in as one of my admins and say sign in. You'll see that it's the Richard application, and here are those three permissions that we defined. Access data anytime, which is offline access. Sign in as you, which was the OpenID permission scope, and then read all groups. When I say accept, it's going to essentially finish the sign in. Now it looks like the page is broken, but it's just because I'm not actually running anything on localhost. But if you zoom in here, you can see it is localhost, and then I have a code. That is my authorization code, which means I have successfully done the first step of this OAuth flow. The second step we'll do here in a moment, but essentially it's performing an HTTP post where I actually get tokens to call services. But one of the things that I'll point out here, is the fact that we did not actually admin consent this. All we did is the admin user has used the application for themselves. They haven't accepted it for all users. And that's done on purpose. And let me show you kind of what the experience is going to be for a normal user. So let's go in here and sign in as a normal user. So in this case, I'm going to sign in as someone named Lily. And we'll go ahead and put in our password. And you can see it says, hey, this Richard application needs admin approval. And it says, yeah, your admin needs to essentially grant access to the resources in here. You don't have permission to do that. So that's what admin consent means. And again, this is the reason why, in general, you should try to avoid permission scopes that need admin consent. That doesn't mean, like, if you have a great idea for an application and it needs a permission that does need admin consent, you can't do it. It just means you're going to have to go through the process of identifying who an admin might be so that it can be introduced into the organization. If you already like sell through IT and it's an administrator that's normally deploying your software to the enterprise, then that's probably not a big deal. But let me show you how you actually perform an admin consent. So we'll go ahead and close this, and we will do an admin consent. So in V2, the way you do an admin consent is you send an administrator through a specific flow where, in this case, it's login.microsoftonline.com/tenant. Now, there's a really important thing I need to point out here is that in a typical flow for a user, you can just use the common authority. So what common means is, hey, this is the same for all tenants. Any organization that's using our application, we can just generically say common. For performing admin consent, it's tenant specific, and so you have to specify the tenant. Now, there's a number of ways that you can get the tenant. You can send the admin user through an ID token flow. So there's all different ways you can get the tenant ID. In fact, one of the ways you could do it is just have them enter in the tenant as like a first step, or have them, you can a lot of times defer it from what their domain is. So the tenant here could be anything from richdiz.com. In my case, that's my tenant name. Or it could be a tenant ID. And in fact, I'll show you a tenant ID here in a moment. But I'm just going to use richdiz.com for this. I'll go ahead and get our client ID, which again is the same thing as an app ID. A state is just something that you can pass through this admin consent flow to get back later. So it's actually optional. So I'll just put hello world here. And then our redirect is HTTPS localhost. So let's give this a shot here. And we will paste this into an in-private browser. Now again, a normal user is not going to be able to do admin consent. So if I were to sign in, and I'll just show you that here, it's going to be the same error message. So if we do Lily, it's going to say, hey, it needs admin approval. You can't do this. I mean, that was the same kind of error you saw when she tried to do it just as a normal code authorization flow. So let's do it now as our admin user. So I'll just sign in as my admin account. And what you can see here is this application is saying, hey, it wants to do these things. And if I expand them, you can see, for instance, here's read groups as an application. And here is read all groups as a user. So it's actually specifying between both the delegated permissions and the application permissions. We haven't really used app permissions yet, but in this case, we're consenting to all this. And it's saying this app will be granted for both the specific application, but it's also saying it's doing this for all users in your organization. That's really the important thing here is this admin consent is saying, hey, I'm going to consent this so not only can users use the application, they're not even going to have to consent to it because I'm going to do it for them. So we'll go ahead and say accept. And what it's going to do up here in the URI is you can see the callback. It sent me back to localhost. But in this case, I get this admin consent equals true, and I get my tenant ID. So I get the actual tenant ID of the tenant that did this. So I'll go ahead and copy this so I can use it later. And we'll put that in my OneNote. So let's say tenant ID. All right, so now that we've admin consented this, our normal user should be able to get access to data. So let's try that. Let's try again as Lily. Let's send her through a normal sign-in flow. So we'll close this. We'll go ahead and open a new in private browser. And we'll sign in as Lily. So we'll just say we're going to stay signed in. And you can see we were successful. Now, again, it looks like a broken screen, but up at the top, you can see I have an authorization code. So essentially, we were successful. So I'm going to copy this authorization code because we're going to use it now to actually get an access token. So let's see. Go. There's actually two things here. There's a state, a session state, which I don't need. And then again, there's that authorization code. So let me try copying this thing for us. So there is our authorization code that we're going to use in the second step. So the second step of actually getting a token happens silently. So your application would essentially listen for this callback, and then it's going to perform an HTTP post in order to actually get access tokens. And I'm going to do that in Postman. Essentially, you would do this from code, but I'm just going to do it a manual way here in Postman. So I've already set this up, and you can see I'm going to do an HTTP post to login at microsoftonline.com/common. Again, I'm just a normal delegated flow here. When you're getting user tokens, you can use this generic common authority. You don't have to know the tenant for these. And now there's a bunch of parameters I'm going to have to fill in. So you can see it's a grant type of authorization code. Again, I'll post our authorization code in here. So there's our authorization code. But some of the other things I need are like my client ID. So I'll go ahead and zoom out here and fill in some of these other details out of Notepad. So let's get our app ID. I need our app secret. So let's go ahead and grab this secret. And again, this is happening on behind the scenes. And then finally our scope. So in this case, we want OpenID, offline access, and group.read.all. So let's see if that works. I might need to put pluses in here between these scopes, but let's give this a shot. We'll go ahead and do a send, and we get tokens back. Now there's two types of tokens. You can see I have, or actually three types of tokens came back in this. I have an access token, I have a refresh token, and I have an ID token. An access token is what I actually use to get data. So this is something I'm going to include in all my requests to get data. The refresh token is essentially my way of, that's that offline access. It's going to give me longer term access to data. The access token is only good for an hour. So let's say my application is running for 3 hours. What do? Well, I can use the refresh token silently to get new access tokens. I'm not going to cover that in this video, but it's a really simple call that says, in fact, it's this same type of post. I'm going and saying I want a token, but instead of a grant type of authorization code, I'm doing a grant type of refresh token. And essentially, that will give me a new access token. And a refresh token is good for, it varies depending on tenant, but it's usually good for a rolling 2 weeks. So you can keep extending it more and more. Sometimes they're good forever for some tenants, but in other tenants, it's usually like around 90 days maximum length of extending it. And then an ID token provides just some information about the user. These are what we call JOT tokens or JSON Web Tokens. And it actually is made up of multiple parts. So there's usually a header, a payload, and a signature. So there's usually 3 parts in most of these tokens. At least an access token has that. And those 3 parts are separated by period. And it's odd. I'm so used to looking at these, I can usually find them really quick, the whole thing. So let's just take a look at one of these. Here is the payload for this token. So I'm just going to copy this. And I'll go to a browser and just go to base64 decode. Bing has great tools for doing this, and I can actually decode it just right here in line. So let's just decode this. And there you can actually see the payload of this token. So it has, it has Lily's unique name, her UPN, her first name, her last name, the tenant ID. It has all this information, the app name that this is for. If you look in here, where is it? There should be scopes in here. Where are they? Okay, so SCP is the scope. So this is group.read.all. So all that information is here in that token. You typically aren't going to break this open and look at it. This is more for debugging. If you ever have an issue with your token, it's very helpful sometimes to break it open and make sure it's all good. But what we're going to do now is use the token in order to perform an operation against the graph. So let's grab our access token here, the full thing, not just the payload of it, the entire thing. And we're going to go and perform a get operation to get groups. Remember, that was kind of the permission we set up, is we wanted to get groups. And the way you do this is just real simple. I'm doing a get to graph.microsoft.com / in this case, I'm using a beta endpoint / groups. The key is you need to include a header information. So you're going to use the authorization header, and you're going to set it equal to bearer space and the access token. So you can see there's a little space between bearer and the access token. And that's essentially how I get access to this. So let's just, I'll zoom out here just really quickly, say send, and you can see I get data back. So this has all my groups. If I were to exclude the authorization header, watch what happens. It says, hey, you need to include a token. And so that's essentially the keys to the kingdom, is providing that access token here when you perform your query. So we did a successful delegated, like getting a token as a user, performing an operation as a user. In this case, we couldn't do anything that Lily couldn't do because Lily, the token is for Lily. It's not for all users in a tenant, which is what we're going to go and do next. So we've already admin consented this, and that is not only was it a prerequisite for normal users to use this application, it was also a prerequisite for any application permissions. So again, if you want to run something as like a super user account that can query all users or do operations as any user, you need application permissions to do that. And that's a separate type of flow. And it's actually a simpler flow because there's no user involved. A code authorization flow will always, 100% of the time, involve a user spending time in a browser. 100% of the time, even if it's like a client application, like a mobile app, we'll typically pop up some sort of login process in the mobile app. It may not look like a browser, but it actually is. So again, a code authorization flow 100% of the time will involve a browser. For application permissions, it's just saying, hey, go get a token. It's not a two-step process. So here I've already defined kind of that process. Again, I'm going to a token endpoint. You can see the token endpoint here. And then I'm providing it just some basic information. The grant type is what's called a client credential. This is what's considered a client credential flow in Azure Active Directory for doing application permissions. So let's fill in some of just the details. So I need my app ID and app secret. So we'll go ahead and put that in here, my app ID and my app secret. Now this is an interesting thing. It's asking if we need a scope for app permissions with an Azure AD v2 application. You don't put in the actual scopes that you've predefined. You put in the resource's default scope. And what this means, what this is saying is, go and get an application token for all of the scopes that are set up for this application behind the scenes. So that's why you see this graph.microsoft.com /.default. This will not work if I go and put in explicit scopes in here. You need to do the application default for this application. The other thing I'll point out here is that I have my tenant ID in the token endpoint. I'm not using the common authority. In fact, let me show you what will happen if I just do common. So let me remove this. We'll say common, and this will actually give me back a token. So if I go in and do a send here, you'll see I get an access token. So you might say, oh, well, I'm good to go. But this access token does not have any identity information because I didn't get it for a specific tenant. So what happens is if I go over here to the graph call and say I'll replace the token here, say we'll put this token in here, this is going to fail. It's going to say, wait, the identity of the calling application could not be established. And that's because we did not get our token using a specific tenant. That is a requirement when you're getting application-only tokens. It's very important you remember that because you will run into this issue every time. So let's go fix where we got that application token. Instead of using that common authority, let's go over to OneNote and let's grab our tenant ID again, and let's use that in there instead. So I'm going to replace common with our tenant ID. And actually watch the size of this JOT token. It's actually going to get bigger. So let's do the send again. And it's probably hard to see, but it's a little bit longer of a JOT token. That's because it now contains the identity information that we need. So I'll copy this access token. We'll go here, and now when we perform our query with this new token, this will actually, when I paste it in here, you can see it's longer. It clearly got longer. And when I click send, we get data back. So here I've covered both kind of the typical delegated flow, which is a code authorization flow. We did admin consent, and we showed why you need to do admin consent. And then we showed doing an application permission against the Microsoft Graph. I guess one thing I'll point out in terms of admin consent, if you're going to build an application that needs admin consent, either because you're using a permission scope that requires admin consent, or you're building something that uses application permissions, I would typically recommend that you put the, the admin consent as part of the onboarding of your software. So like essentially you have some sort of guide of, hey, part of the setup of our software is you're going to need an admin to go in here and consent to these things. The other thing I would point out is you essentially could build an application that requires admin consent scopes, so something like groups.readall or users.readall, but you can actually have the user just sign in without any permission scope. So when we did, going back to OneNote here, when we did this flow, you notice that like we specified the group.readall permission scope. I could actually get rid of this. So if I got rid of that and had Lily do this before we did admin consent, it would work. Because essentially what I'm doing is when she's signing in, she's saying, hey, I want to sign in for this app, but I'm not trying to get access to these things that require admin consent. I'm just signing in to essentially prove my identity. So that totally works. You can totally do that and then at some point later try to make an admin consent to the application so that they can do more advanced things. But I would typically say it's a better practice to, if you're going to do anything that requires admin consent, is to make it part of the onboarding of your software. It doesn't mean there's not other creative ways of introducing it, but that's kind of my recommendation. So what I'll do is I'll try to organize all the kind of raw manual calls that I did here into a blog post that you can reference. But hopefully this video is helpful in showing you and demystifying some of the things in an Azure AD V2 application around what needs admin consent, how you perform admin consent, and then even going further to look at application permissions for the application. Thanks, and hopefully this was helpful.